Are millions of people about to be deported in the United States? Are we going to actually witness some form of denaturalization? Well, one thing we do know is Trump is not very happy with certain immigrant populations within the state of Minnesota. And he was pretty overt about it, not to mention the fact that there's now a travel ban with 19 different countries. And all of this is stemming from a couple of things that have happened recently. And let's face it, a lot of things that have been happening over the last several decades. One of this being an enormous fraud case, which has been revealed in Minnesota. And interestingly enough, it was revealed by people that you would think were big fans of Tim Walz. But it doesn't appear that's the case. In fact, it appears that certain elements of the Minnesota bureaucracy are actually so infuriated by over $1 billion lost in fraud that they're actually coming out and saying something, and it's leading to something far more than just dealing with that individual issue. So we're going to discuss some items today. One of the big things that we're going to discuss is this concept with respect to the current immigration crisis within the United States. And no, I don't just mean the illegal immigration crisis. I also mean the legal, or maybe we should say quasi-legal crisis we have as well. So we're going to address a couple of questions, because one of the things that I've heard throughout my entire life is, well, of course, immigrants built this country, and of course, diversity is our strength. But is it? We're going to take a look at all of that. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
Then, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines.
Hello.
And before we jump into some of the framing here, we're also going to do a big shout out and thank you to True Classic, sponsor of today's show. True Classic has one objective, ladies and gentlemen, and that's to make guys look good with respect to what they're wearing. I hope I'm doing a pretty good job right here. Certainly through no efforts of my own. It's all True Classic. And you can get True Classic not just on the show or through the show. You can also get it at places like Target and Costco. One of the reasons why I love True Classic is because I feel like it fits the way it should fit, right? And let's face it, guys, if you're looking good for your wife, hey, there's other benefits to that beyond just feeling good about yourself. So I want you to go over to trueclassic.com/Nick, trueclassic.com/Nick. Check out some of the bundles they have. All right, let's go ahead and kick it off by framing this whole thing up. So, Minnesota staff fraud reporting commentaries. This comes from the Minnesota DHS, right? Minnesota DHS came out and says, Tim Walz is 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. We let Tim Walz know of fraud early on, hoping a partnership in stopping fraud, but no, we got the opposite response. Tim Walz systematically retaliated against whistleblowers using monitoring, threats, repression, and did his best to discredit fraud reports. Instead of partnership, we got the full weight of retaliation by Tim Walz, certainly DFL members, and indifferent mainstream media. It's scary, isolating, and left us wondering who we can turn to. In addition to retaliating against whistleblowers, Tim Walz disempowered the office of the legislative auditor, allowing agencies to disregard their office of legislative audit, allowing agencies to disregard their audit findings and guidance. Media and politicians supporting Tim Walz or the DFL agenda attacked whistleblowers who were trying to raise red flags on fraudulent activities. And it goes on to explain so much more. We won't read the whole thing, but we encourage you to go and check it out on X. I mean, this was pretty bad. Again, they're anticipating at this point it's over $1 billion. They go on to say, as such, we can't fight fraud in Minnesota alone. Hence, why we're appealing to the federal levels of government. We need all the help we can get, as Tim Walz agency leaders have upped their brazen approach in covering up their knowledge of fraud. Now, one of the questions could be asked, why would they do this? Well, one of the primary beneficiaries of a lot of this fraud was the very, very large Somali immigrant population within Minnesota. And that has been increasing exponentially. I mean, we had a place where the mayor of Minneapolis was almost defeated. And he's a very, very liberal, woke mayor, was almost defeated by a Somali immigrant who was going around flying the Somali flag. You see large sectors of this community. And again, I'm not trying to paint a broad brush for all Somali immigrants. That's not what we're doing here. But we are saying that there is an especially large contingent of Somalis that live in the United States, specifically in Minnesota, who seem to have far more loyalty towards Somalia than they do the United States. You've actually seen this with people like Ilhan Omar, who have talked about what they see as their responsibility to advocate for Somalia inside the United States Congress. And this has led to a lot of problems. And it could explain why Tim Walz would be, somewhat reticent to take a very large and very loyal, at least for now, Democrat voting bloc and anger them by pointing out about how much fraud they have been the beneficiaries of. Again, not all Somalis, but quite a large population. Let's go on to the next things about Trump's comments on this, because this is what's got everybody, as usual, what we see is massive fraud. That fraud is largely being directed toward a particular group of people that came over to the United States, that were allowed to come into the United States, fleeing the devastation that is Somalia. And then, of course, the real concern is not the $1 billion in fraud. The real concern is not Tim Walz completely failing his duties to actually do something about it. The real concern is not Tim Walz actively targeting whistleblowers and trying to silence them and shut out so they can bury this story. That's not the real issue. No, the real issue is Donald Trump saying mean things. So let's go ahead and look at exactly what Donald Trump said during a cabinet meeting discussing this issue.
I don't want them in our country. Their country's no good for a reason. Their country stinks, and we don't want them in our country. I could say that about other countries too. We don't want them to hell. We have to rebuild our country. You know, our country's at a tipping point. We could go bad. We're at a tipping point. I don't know if people mind me saying that, but I'm saying it. We could go one way or the other, and we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country. Ilhan Omar is garbage. She's garbage. Her friends are garbage. These aren't people that work. These aren't people that say, let's go, come on, let's make this place great. These are people that do nothing but complain. They complained. And from where they came from, they got nothing. You know, they came from paradise, and they said, this isn't paradise. But when they come from hell, and they complain and do nothing but bitch, we don't want them in our country. Let them go back to where they came from and fix it.
So the general consensus on the left, as you can imagine, is this is horribly racist. This is xenophobic. If you can say this about one group of people, if you can paint an entire group of people with one brush, then what's next? And of course, a lot of people responded, oh, yes. They're responding to the left going, oh, yes. Can you imagine a group of people, I don't know, saying bad things about white straight men? Right? Like there's the obvious hypocrisy. But if we look at the actual language of what he used here, I think there's an important distinction that we need to make if we're going to be intellectually honest. If he had just said, you know, we don't want them there, or we don't want any Somalis, obviously you'd be able to point to Somalis who have either immigrated to the United States or maybe were born here, the children of immigrants, who are loyal, productive, patriotic Americans. Obviously, you'd be able to find those. But he was specific. He talks about Ilhan Omar. He talks about Ilhan Omar's friends. He talks about populations that come over to the United States for which over 70% of them are actually taking in welfare and then sending money home to Somalia. He talks, I mean, he's talking about a specific group of people that, yes, all did come from a particular place. And then he's saying, we don't want people from some of these places. And part of what's going on here is what we call heuristics, right? It's not necessarily painting a broad brush as suggesting that every individual of that place is a bad human being. It's saying, I'm recognizing a pattern in large groups of people coming from this country, coming over to ours, having no appreciation for what America is providing, for what the taxpayers are providing, electing people who are openly subversive. And by the way, probably came to this country under false and illegal pretenses, and say, we don't want them. And the vast majority of Americans are looking at that going, yep.
Well, we're finally getting past this era where we weren't allowed to notice those patterns. We weren't allowed to look at these patterns and go, oh, you know, maybe if you import the third world, you'll get the third world. And we do start to notice that, where it's like, at some point, if you can't assimilate here and understand that in our culture, which we do have a culture, despite what the left wants to say, in our culture, there are certain things that are okay and there are certain things that are not okay. And you have to be able to assimilate to that.
Yeah.
And if you can't or won't, or you despise our culture, you don't belong here.
Yeah, I know. And I think the vast majority of people look at it as fair, because I think most Americans view it as, if I went to your country and you had certain rules or traditions or guidelines in which you conducted yourself, you would expect me to assimilate. And it's not wrong for us to require the same. Let's go ahead and look at this immigration ban order, because we had talked before about this whole idea of, I think it's 19 different countries So let's go ahead and take a look at what this is. And again, from the New York Times, so we're not just tipping the scales here. U.S. pauses immigration applications from nations on travel ban lists. The pause, which will halt green card and U.S. citizenship processing for broad swaths of people, deepens a remarkable crackdown on legal immigration pathways in recent days. And I think it's got the list on here somewhere. Okay, here we go. So the list: Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela, Libya, Sudan, Chad, Yemen, Somalia, Burundi, Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guyana, Togo, Sierra Leone, Iran, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Laos, I think, of the various countries. And what's interesting was when you look at this, Haiti obviously is in the process. I mean, Cuba's a communist country. We've had various embargoes against them for some time because they're openly hostile to the United States. Haiti is a completely failed state at this point. They got a guy named Barbecue going around who's reported to be a cannibal, trying to run the country. Venezuela, obviously, we have ongoing conflicts, which we're going to talk in more depth on future episodes. Sierra Leone, Togo, Equatorial Guyana, Republic of Congo.
Every single one of these countries are either failed states or communist states in the case of Cuba and Laos.
Communist states, failed states, war-torn states.
Or they hate us in the case of Iran.
Support, international supporters of terrorism. I mean, none of this is unreasonable, is what this comes down to. None of these travel bans are unreasonable as a result of this. But again, this is one of those things where they can look at this, oh, well, you know what the common denominator is? And they'll always say, well, it's brown people. You just don't want brown people here. I made it very clear when Mark Kelly made this comment. I was like, I would trade Mark Kelly for five brown people anywhere in the world that desperately want to come and be patriotic Americans that actually appreciate what we have in this country. Because I don't think Mark Kelly does. I don't think Mark Kelly wants to preserve it. So no, this is not about brown people. This is about, there are certain objective criteria that are being used. And quite frankly, if it were me, I'd add more countries to the list. But it isn't me, so we're going to stick with these.
Well, and keep in mind, we're also, in the last administration, they were putting people to the front of the line, basically, due to sort of this pretend refugee status.
Yes.
And which it didn't work at all, according to what a refugee really is and who's supposed to take in a refugee. We were not supposed to be taking in all these refugees. And not only that, but you had terrorists hiding amongst the refugees. And then also, we weren't taking the best and the brightest. We just weren't. Give us your doctors. I'm fine with taking your doctors and all of your best and brightest. Why are we taking everybody's people that, I don't know.
Well, the concept behind a refugee is, and again, look, I can be sympathetic and say that there could be situations where I'd be perfectly fine with people coming in temporarily for refugee status if they were fleeing like for instance, when Canada eventually descends into civil war, I'll be happy to let people from Alberta and Saskatchewan claim refugee status on their pathway to becoming part of America. But this idea that anyone just comes over here and claims refugee status, the way refugee and asylum seekers is supposed to work is you flee to the first country that isn't like actively persecuting you, and that's where you go. And I find it funny that if I look at Somalia, Somalia is arguably, it would be difficult to get farther away from the United States than Somalia. And so let me get this straight. You had to flee through several countries and thousands of miles through places that are far more in common with Somalia with respect to religious traditions, political traditions, tribal traditions, culture, etc. Not exactly the same, but closer than the United States. And then when you show up in Minnesota, you're just angry at how crappy we are in the United States. Okay, well, great, go back.
Yeah, it's like, I want to take everything with me that I'm fleeing from.
Yeah.
All the mindsets, everything with me that I'm fleeing from and bring it.
Well, and the sad part of this is that there are refugees that come to the United States that are so incredibly grateful.
Yeah, we want those
They're
people.
so
We want the people that are grateful. We just...
Something
has significantly changed over certainly the last decade, but I would argue over the last several decades in terms of how we've gone about immigration policy. And Trump's comments about Somalia and the travel bans and stuff like that, I think are emblematic of a consensus that, in the grand scheme of things, is actually a pretty recent consensus, is starting to break down now.
Well, to that point, I think we need to acknowledge that this wasn't just another press conference and this isn't just another catalyst. Something significant has just happened. And part of it is because of these conditions with respect to immigration. Part of it is because the narratives we've all been required to regurgitate, right? We've been required to say immigrants built this country and diversity is our strength. And if you don't believe that, then you're a mean person, you're a xenophobic person, you're a bigoted person. How dare you? So now what we're going to do is we're going to analyze those claims. We're not just going to take them for granted anymore. We're going to analyze these claims. And the way we're going to do it is we're actually going to look at the stats. We're going to look at the stats pre-colonial area in the United States, like pre-13 colonies. We're going to look at what was the process of people coming over to North America, coming over to what is now the United States, forming through the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, immigration throughout the United States. We're going to look at all of that. We're going to look at those stats and we're going to answer the question: did immigrants build the country, and is diversity our strength? So the first thing that we're going to take a look at here is we're going to look. Well, I don't think we got this one for. Do we have one pre-colonial?
Unfortunately, there's no hard statistics on it, but you can talk about generalities on this.
Go ahead and take it away with this graph.
Yeah, so this graph shows immigration by region to the United States from 1820 to 2020. So it's a 200-year period. 1820, about a generation after we got our independence. Now, if you look at American history before our independence, the Federalist Papers actually talks about this. John Jay was asked, who are the American people? What is this country? And he was like, we're bound together by a common culture, tradition, language, history. We are one people from one land. And what he meant by that was we're English. So, Tina was bringing up earlier that when people are coming from other parts of the world, they're bringing their culture with them. That's a very common thing if you think about it throughout history.
And that's okay if it's a great culture.
When it is, but not all cultures are equal.
Right.
And so when
but we're not allowed to notice that.
Well, you're right. But one way to think about it is when the English settled at Jamestown in the early 1600s, they didn't become Powhatan Indians when they landed at Jamestown, right? They were English. They stayed English even though they were 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. And so you look at the way that immigration, patterns follow. This is a common thing throughout history. When the Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine River in the early 5th century into Gaul, which was part of the Roman Empire at the time, they didn't become Romans. And the Romans were excellent assimilators. The Romans were able to turn Greeks into Romans. So, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Etruscans, they were excellent at assimilating. But when you have a mass movement of people, right, you don't have like one or two individuals, you have entire tribes, you have whole nations that are moving in. When the Franks and the Visigoths and the Vandals and the Ostrogoths, and the Alans and the Burgundians came into Gaul and into Hispania and eventually into like North Africa and Northern Italy, they didn't become Romans. They became Germans in a different area. And that was the end of the Western Roman Empire. It just disintegrated because the Romans were replaced by a different group of people that weren't Roman and recognized that they weren't Roman. And there was no assimilation pressure. Likewise, when the English came to Jamestown, they didn't become Indians. They were English. And they stayed English, and they rebuilt something that was very similar to England on a different continent. They were 3,000 miles away, and yet they were still English. John Smith was still English. He didn't become Indian. And they constructed a legal system. Even their architecture was similar to the English. Now, over time, they became something different. This is the process of what you would call ethnogenesis. It's the creation of a new group of people. In the same way that when the Germanic tribes came into the Roman territory in the 5th century, they weren't Germans forever. The Vandals became, the Visigoths became the first layer of what became modern day Spain. The Franks didn't stay German. They became French eventually over time. The Ostrogoths, when they came into Italy, eventually became Italians. That's why Italians are slightly different than Romans. And so groups of people can emerge over time. The English as a term, as we understand them, they didn't exist 2,000 years ago. They were Celts and Romans that were living there. But the English today are the combination of many somewhat related and somewhat different groups of people living in the same area, intermarrying, living together, and building a collective identity over time, over the course of hundreds of years. The same thing happened with Americans, right? The English came over, they colonized Jamestown, and it was almost entirely English immigration for hundreds of years. So that was a long-winded answer of the pre-colonial era, but before independence, America was effectively 100% English. It was 100% English and Protestant, not even just Catholic.
It was overwhelmingly English or the British Isles, and then this is also illustrative of the fact that when you look at the signers of the Declaration of Independence, signers of the Declaration, 56 signers, 48 of the 56 signers were born in America. The remaining 8 were immigrants born in Europe. 2 were from England, 2 from Ireland, 2 from Scotland, 1 from Northern Ireland, 1 from Wales. And then of the 48 that were born in the United States, they were overwhelmingly British, right? With some of Scottish, Welsh, or Irish. So again, it's part of the larger British Isles or Great Britain. So here's what's important to understand. The other thing that's different is when we talk about immigration versus settling. Okay, I as an individual can immigrate to your country, right? And now I'm an immigrant to your country. And presumably what I do by immigrating is I come over to your country and I assimilate into your country. Now, I bring my personality, I bring my cultural traditions and things like that, but ultimately yours is the culture which dominates that. Settling is different. Settling is when you actually go to an area that is not necessarily uninhabited, but there's not a great deal of development. There's not a great deal of, it may be inhabited to some degree, but it's not like an overwhelming population. It's usually low population density. And this goes where you set up with colonies. It's the idea that you're not just going to be an immigrant into something else which already exists. You're actually bringing your culture for the purpose of actually expanding that culture there. So it's important to understand that when we talk about immigration to the United States prior to the 13 colonies of the Declaration of Independence, we're largely talking about settlers. This is not to discount the fact that there were, tribes here in the United States or tribes that would have became the United States. I get it. There was complex societies with respect to the Iroquois Confederation, but there was nothing with respect to the development of the population density that you saw in Europe. Does that make it right? We're not debating that right now. We're just saying what was, okay? So you had settlers came here, settled, and developed a country. Great. What sort of country did they develop? Well, we can go to our Declaration of Independence. We can go to our Constitution. When we look at our Declaration of Independence, what do we find? Do we find a diversity of various people that signed the Declaration of Independence? No, we do not. We don't even find a diversity of Europeans. We don't even find a diversity of Western Europeans. We find an almost exclusive group of people of descent from the British Isles developing our Declaration of Independence and then following on, because you have different signers for the Declaration of Independence versus the Constitution, but it's essentially identical with respect to ethnicity and heritage, developing our Constitution, which is why the Constitution was developed the way it was, right? And by the way, when you look at this 56 signers, it's not just about where they came from, because a lot of times your ethnic history is not the core component of your identity. Fine, let's look at what most of these people would have identified as one of the fundamental components of their identity, their religion, okay? What were they? The signers of the Declaration of Independence were overwhelmingly of Protestant church denominations. So Episcopalian or Anglican, 32. Congregationalist, 13. Presbyterian, 12. Quaker, 2. Unitarian or Rationalist, 2. Roman Catholic, 1. So what do we have? We have a government that was established by Protestants from the British Isle who built our government, who settled the land and built our government. That is who did it. It was not, immigrants did not build the country in that respect. Okay. But Nick, there's so much more to building a country than just establishing, independence and establishing the very structure for which your state and federal government will operate from. Surely we can acknowledge the contributions from immigrants on other. Absolutely. Don't deny it for 1 second. Now go look at the beginning of this chart. And what do we see from 1820 to essentially 1950? The vast majority of immigration to the United States were European. And if we were to actually to dig into those European numbers, what we would find is we'd find predominantly Western European.
I have a set of numbers from 1790, which was the first census that was conducted. So this is slightly before this chart, just to kick us off with independence, because again, there weren't like data collected on this before independence because they were all coming from England basically. But if you look at these numbers here, this was immigrants before 1790 and America's population in 1790. And you see that these were African slaves. That was the one exception from outside of it,
Yeah.
like substantial exception. We had them since 1619.
Yeah.
And you see, England is the out of a country of almost 4 million, 2.1 million were directly from England. And keep in mind, this is just one part of the United Kingdom, right?
Yeah.
The rest of them are effectively coming from Scots-Irish. There were a few Germans. You see Scotland, Ireland, and then there were a
Netherlands,
few
Wales, France.
from the Netherlands, Wales, France, and then there were 2,000 Jews and 2,000
Now, people will say
Swedes.
that this is proof that, okay, so African slaves built the country. No, they did not. I'm not saying that African slaves did not play a critical role with respect to the agrarian economies of the South. They absolutely did. But again, when we talk about building the country, when we talk about the various infrastructure that made the United States what it was, they did not have a great deal of influence on that process.
There were as many Scots, Irish, and Germans in 1790 as there were African slaves.
Well, and the difference is also, and look, this none of what I'm saying right here is to take away from what I believe is the sin of slavery. But it's also important to understand when we're talking about building a country, building a nation, and what do we think of with respect to the social, political, religious, cultural, economic institutions, we have our answer. We have our answer. Now, again, go back to the previous chart. This is what you see as immigration to the United States all the way to pre-World War II. So, again, I would. This is not to take away from immigrant contributions, but I'm a little bit tired of hearing that nope, it's just immigrants that built the country, because all the way up until pre-World War II, even the people that were coming to this country, the country was originally established by predominantly people that were born in the colonies of British descent. Other people came on largely from Western Europe. Now, what is obviously a lot of fighting among European countries. However, generally speaking, Protestant or Catholic, which means Christian. On top of that, you also have a lot of similar traditions with respect to holidays, things they celebrate. You have, intermarriage. You have a number of things that are taking place, which would cause me to, let's put it this way. I would be far more aware of the rules, the general unwritten rules and traditions of society if you placed me, an American of Portuguese and Scots-Irish descent, if you placed me in Paris, France, I would be far more, maybe not Paris these days, if you were to place me in France 20 years ago, I'd be far more familiar with the rules and cultural traditions, despite the fact that I'm not French and I've never spent much time in France, than if you put me in Uganda. Okay, that's not by accident. That's because of the migration patterns that took place within Europe. It's because of all of those things. Okay, so that's what influenced and effectively built and drove the cultural, economic, social, political, and religious institutions within the United States of America. That's what did it. All right. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is what is the difference with respect to the experience of the immigrant? If you were coming to the United States, especially in the 19th century, but we could argue largely all the way pre-World War II. If you were coming to the United States, we'll say in 1870, you were probably fleeing some sort of conflict or some sort of rigid system which prevented you from being able to either have as much control over your property as you wanted. In many cases, the government could arbitrarily confiscate your property, take your property, but prevent you from doing things that in America would have seemed absurd to prevent you from doing so. So what do? Well, you scrape together every last penny you have. You get your family together on a boat where you are basically staying in an overcrowded portion of the boat in order to make it to the United States. You probably come in through Ellis Island or one of the other major ports of entry, and you show up, and which federal welfare programs are available to sustain you? None. They don't exist. Which state welfare programs are available to sustain you? For the most part, none. They probably don't exist. Really, so then how do you survive? Well, it's one of two ways. Either you have local charitable groups, which are sometimes ethnic in nature. You had various Irish communities, Italian communities, etc. Or you had religious communities. You had religious charities that might provide you some means of not starving to death or help get you placed in a field where you could actually make your own living. But it was automatically expected that if you were coming to the United States, two things were understood. One, you were coming to become an American, and you were happy and excited about that prospect. Two, you were going to make it on your own. You were going to make it. You were not coming to the United States for goodies. You were coming to the United States for opportunities. That's why you were coming. And you were grateful for them because you knew exactly what it was to be deprived of them in other places. What happened post-World War II? Well, post-World War II, we changed the rules altogether. But what you end up seeing is now this is where we get a massive influx from other cultures, largely outside of the traditional social, economic, political, and religious traditions of the United States and the British Isles, and you could argue the larger Western European countries. This is where we start importing tens of millions of people over the last several decades that did not necessarily share those traditions. The other thing that you see, especially after the 1960s, you see the creation of a massive welfare state, both on the federal and the state level. And where does that get us? So what is the process now for immigrating to the United States? Oh, okay. Well, I come into the United States probably illegally. I come in illegally, and then when I get caught, I claim asylum status. And then what happens, especially under something like the Joe Biden regime, is you get a court date. You get a court date to demonstrate whether or not you actually can legally file for asylum based off of international law and U.S. law. When you get your court date, you ignore it. You ignore your court date, and then you go down, if you're in Southern California, you go down to MacArthur Park and you buy illegal documentation. You get a Social Security card, you get a driver's license, and then what do? You sign up for welfare benefits. Even if you don't sign up for welfare benefits, right? Because that's a common claim made by Cato Institute and others. Oh, they're not even eligible for it. Oh, because we all know if you're not eligible for something, there's no illegal way to get access to it, right? But what happens to your kids? Well, they get to go to public school. Okay, does that cost anything? Yeah, of course it does. What if you want to go have a child? Are you forced to actually pay for the medical bills associated with you going in and going to the hospital? Nope, because of Entella laws. You can't be denied access to care based off of your inability to pay. Okay, so what about the taxes that you do pay? Are you paying federal income taxes? Maybe if you actually got a fake Social Security card, you might have to pay some there. You're going to pay property taxes some way. You're going to pay sales taxes some way. But the bottom line is you're not paying the same percentage of your income as a United States citizen. And there's all kinds of illegal ways for you to be able to get access to benefits. And there's a bunch of legal ways for you to get access to benefits. Not to mention the fact that in some of these cases where you have large-scale populations either crossing the border from the south or you have refugee status of people coming in from places like Afghanistan or Somalia, you're not coming over in a trickle. It's not one or two families coming. No, it's thousands of people coming over at a time and then all going to the same location and setting up their own communities. So there is no assimilation. Why would you? It used to be part of the reason why you had to assimilate was because if you wanted to actually be effective, you had to be able to speak the language. You had to be able to take on certain traditions. Because in high trust societies, one of the things that makes it capable for us to work together and trust one another, because trust is necessary for a free society, is you adopt some of those cultural traditions. You certainly don't bring over the traditions that potentially contributed to the reasons you fled your country in the first place. And yet, because of massive welfare, because of certain representation, especially within the Democratic Party, that says that assimilation is not only not something you have to do, it's bad, we have something entirely different now. The question is it working?
No, it's causing us to become very tribal. Our country is just fractured with all these different communities, like tribes. And so what happens is there's distrust between the various factions now. And I don't believe that diversity is our strength. Like they say that's a strength. It really isn't when you're so fractured.
Here's what I would say. We started this off by asking a question. Did immigrants build this country? And is diversity our strength? Here's what I'm going to conclude based off of what we just looked at and other things we've talked about. Settlers created our country. There's no questions that immigrants have contributed to what the United States has become. In some positive ways, and I would say more recently, more negative ways. And the reason why more negative ways recently is for precisely this reason, because diversity is not our strength. That is a stupid statement. Diversity can be a strength when there is unity of purpose. If I want to build a house, I will need a plumber. I will need an architect. I will need a carpenter. I will need an electrician. I will need someone to pour a foundation. That is a diversity of skill sets, all focused on one mission, building a house. But I can have diversity another way. I can say, I want to build a house. So I'm going to get a crackhead, a prostitute, a nurse, and an astronomer. Well, I have diversity. That's the only strength that's required, right? No, diversity of skill set, diversity of capability, diversity maybe of experience or perspective, driven toward unity of purpose for which those diverse skill sets are relevant. That is a strength. But the sort of garbage that we've had pushed upon us in order to justify what has been taking place is not a strength, and it is leading to the demise of our country because of the fractionalization that Tina mentioned. So that's my answer to that question.
Creating a more diverse environment in your previous analogy about a construction site. Yeah. What we have right now is basically we've increased our diversity and brought some people over to eat everybody's lunch while everybody else is working on the house.
So I've got two examples that goes back to some of the stories that we were talking about at the start of this podcast to illustrate the problem. Because this chart that Nick was referencing earlier, that shows the 200-year period from 1820 to 2020. I mean, first off, you see the huge change where until the 1950s and 60s, the overwhelming majority, we're talking like 90% plus of immigration was coming from Europe. Most of this wasn't, it was Western Europe and Northern Europe, not even just the entire European continent.
And let's clarify something, because we always get the racism claim here, okay? Obviously, there's a variety of ethnicities. There's a variety of tribes, we're ultimately tribes in Western Europe as well. When we put this emphasis that it was the British Isles that created the country and largely Western Europe, which has defined its institutions, the emphasis is not on race. The emphasis is on the culturally shaping institutions, right? Now, it just so happens that certain racial groups chose not, for whatever reason, within their geographical areas, to develop the same cultural traditions as the people which created the United States and were largely responsible for its development.
I would go a little
and so I'm looking at this going, what is so wrong with pointing this out?
So on your point, I would add a little bit more of a caveat. For once, I'm actually going to caveat something that Nick said. I actually think that it's about cultural differences, not necessarily racial differences.
Yes.
So for example, because you were bringing up like certain racial groups came up with particular ways of living, but like the way of living between the Germans and the Poles was different.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, it's the same racial group. The Nazis would have disagreed, right?
Yeah.
But like on a genetic level, like they're both white, they're both Europeans.
Yeah.
But their way of living was very different. You could do the same thing with like the way that there's a guy that used to be a co-host on Carl Benjamin's show, Connor Tomlinson, and now he does his own thing. He's an independent guy. And he was interviewed a few days ago, maybe a few weeks ago, and was asked point blank, like, what makes you it was almost like a challenge. It was like, what makes you different from a white nationalist? Because he's like, I'm a nationalist. He's an English nationalist. He wants England to be for the English. And he's like, I'll tell you right now, Albanians are pasty white.
Yeah.
And they are the highest overrepresentation but on a per capita basis within the English prison system.
Yeah.
I don't want to be mass importing Albanians into my country. They practice a radically different way of life than the one that I do here in my country. Same skin tone, but very, very different ways of living. And so I don't want them here. And that doesn't make me a bad person, because I say they can have Albania, but I want to have England to be for people that practice a lifestyle the way that I do. So this is why I said that it's actually, I think, deeper than even racial differences. I think that it's cultural differences.
Well, that was the point I was making. The point that I was making is
that's why I said I'm adding a caveat to it.
They keep one again. The left is the one that has become absolutely obsessed with race, and it's purely for political purposes. It's not that they don't understand that there's a difference between race and culture. It's that everyone understands the heuristic. When I visually see something, I start to make assumptions based off of my experiences, understanding of history, etc. Right? Now, a mature person, and I would argue a moral person, does not automatically assign a whole litany of stereotypes to an individual based off of their skin color or their height or whatever other visual representation we can see at any given point. But what does happen is degrees of probability. So if I am,
It's pattern recognition.
yes, if I'm walking around and I see someone that looks very similar to me, the assumption that that person will speak the same language, have similar understandings of traditions, might have similar backgrounds or experiences, right? Especially if I see them in a common neighborhood or something like that. Those are all rational conclusions. If I then believe that, no, I must insist that you believe these things as a result of that, that is not rational. That's not reasonable. That's not moral. If I see someone that looks drastically different from me, dressed differently from me, and I come to the initial conclusion that, oh, maybe we speak the same language, maybe we don't. Maybe we worship the same God, maybe we don't. That's also rational. Now, if I insist that they can't speak my language, can't be from my neighborhood, can't worship the same God, that's not rational. But it's the left doing that predominantly. There's obviously elements on the right as well. And this is the part where it's, again, here's my big problem with this. You know the left is full of crap on this. And here's how you know. Because if we picked up 1 million Americans and shipped them to Somalia tomorrow, the left would not call it immigration. The left would not call it refugee status. The left would not call it cultural diversity. They would call it colonization. So I don't care about their insults anymore. I don't care about what they say. They have demonstrated so many bad faith arguments about this that I don't even really consider their opinions anymore because I can't trust them to engage with reality in a way that both of us can appreciate. But the big question I have is, you look at that, so again, with the exception of the importation of African slaves in the first half of the United States history, you see a trend. And then that trend ends. Now, the left would say, well, yes, it ends because we stop being the horrible racist bigots. Why do you, what actually changed to actually drastically alter the demographics
So
there?
it started in World War II. We started bringing, during the war, we brought over some Mexicans to work in munition factories in large
So we allowed
numbers.
for greater immigration.
We allowed
of
for
Mexican
greater
yeah.
immigration from Latin America. And so you start to see this increase here in the 40s with the purple line, which is from Mexico. And then in the 50s, we loosened some of the immigration laws from the 1924 Immigration Act.
Yeah.
This is what established what was called the National Origins Formula. The National Origins Formula was a way to try to come up with a representation of what America was like close to the time frame in terms of okay, this is the cultural and demographic makeup of the country. We have X number of people from this part of the world and Y number of people from that part of the world, and we're going to create a quota system that's going to reflect that in order to keep the demographics similar to it at the time of its passage.
And of course that got characterized as racially motivated. And again, probably some people did like it for the racial components, but you could just as easily make an argument that, well, if this country exists and operates a certain way, importing people from countries that exist very, very differently, and in fact, in some cases, have traditions which are diametrically opposed to our own, is problematic, especially if you bring them over en masse. Again, the vast majority of us, when you hear it explained that way, when you hear you just want white people, it's like, well, no, that's okay, that's bad. I agree with that. But when you say, well, no, we have certain cultural traditions, other cultural traditions are conducive, others are not. We can allow more from cultural traditions that are conducive and less from those that are not.
And what happened in 1965 was we passed what's known as the Hart-Celler Act, which ended the national origins formula and effectively created an open system for the entire world to come here. And you see the chart just blows out for the entire rest of the world. European immigration eventually goes close to zero. If you get down here it's hard to show it on screen unfortunately, it's just the nature. I can't, yeah, if possible. There we go. Nice. So this goes to 2020, right?
Yeah.
And obviously this decade hasn't ended yet, so it's still building. But you see in the last decade, I mean, it was overwhelmingly from Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Caribbean, and a tiny number from Europe, right?
Yeah.
the huge explosion has been from Latin America and Asia more than anywhere else, and you're starting to see a growth with Africa and the Caribbean. But the Hart-Celler Act changed the national origins formula. It removed, from the left-wing perspective, they would say, well, this removed all these bigoted barriers to immigration. The problem is that people aren't blank slates. You can't just pick somebody. I said this earlier, right? You took English settlers in 1600, and then you dropped them in North America in the early 1600s. They did not become Powhatan Indians. That was the local tribe that was near here.
They didn't become,
They stayed English. Now, they changed over time. Like, Americans today are not English. This is why I said ethnogenesis is a thing. One group of people, through an interaction with other groups of people, can become a new group of people over time. But because people aren't blank slates and people have radically different ways of life, metaphysical belief systems, religion, culture, traditions, and history, if you take people from a radically different background in history and worldview and you drop them into a country that for hundreds of years had been an Anglo-Protestant country, and in a more broadly sense, a Western European, mostly Protestant country, you're going to radically change that country. If I took, and this is the difference about immigration, the nuance here, because does that mean that you can't find an individual? Like, group differences exist, but individuals are still individuals.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you can't find individuals on an individual basis who, for whatever reason, actually do want to practice a different lifestyle than the one that they came from. But those people tend to be very rare. A good example of this are weebs or otakus, like in the West, people that love Japanese culture and tradition. And yeah, they're not like ethnically or genetically Japanese, but if you plopped them in Honshu, they would do their best to assimilate because they love that culture. The analogy that I've used before with a few friends is, I don't know why I came up with this, but imagine if you took somebody that loves Japan who lives in Quebec, and you plop them in Honshu. Yes, they wouldn't ethnically be Japanese, but they would assimilate, especially if they're one person. There'd be a strong pressure for them to assimilate. Now imagine if you took the entire population of Quebec and you dropped that in Honshu.
You'd have a little Quebec.
Would they be Japanese? No, they would be they would do exactly what they're doing in Canada today. They'd be their own separate voting bloc that would elect people to the Japanese diet, and they would be Quebecois nationalists in Japan.
Well, there's also an issue of loyalty. I think when you brought up the example of the fact that when Europeans settled the United States before it was the United States, basically they began a process of becoming a country by kind of starting a fight with their previous country and burning the ship, so to speak, and fighting a war in order to identify as something different from that country. And right now what we have are a lot of people who still have so much loyalty to the former country. They would never renounce their former country. But as Americans, I mean, sort of the birth of America was to renounce our former country. And that's a glaring difference. It's one of the reasons why I feel like in the US, first of all, I'm not a fan of dual citizenship. I think if you're going to be an American, you should be an American. I don't think you have to hate your former country necessarily, but you definitely need to not have loyalties there anymore.
At least not those which supersede the United States.
Not to their government systems. Obviously, you'll be loyal to your family, of course.
Nobody's, we want that.
But we don't want people to come here while still being loyal to another country. This is where you get people like Ilhan Omar going around talking to, in Somalia, telling them that she's looking out for their interests in the U.S. That should never be. And I have a real issue with that. And in fact, I don't think necessarily you should hold office if you are a first generation naturalized American. I feel like that should be a parameter.
We have that for the presidency, although we're going to
get into conclusions toward the end where everybody gets to offer. Everyone's going to get their time to offer what they would do to try to fix this. But I do think it's important to understand why this happened, why it was. And again, the liberal answer is because we were all racist then, and then finally we got in charge, and now we're enlightened, and now we don't do racist things anymore. But the bottom line is that I struggle to find people that are not more racist in what we would have considered to be the traditional meaning of that word. There's another thing too that I want to point out. A lot of times I will hear people accuse the left of being cultural relativists. No, they're not. A cultural relativist doesn't believe that there's any strong moral delineation between various cultures. The left believes the opposite. The left believes that pretty much every culture is superior to ours. And it's evident in the way that they treat our culture, or even deny that we have one in the first place.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
They're weakophobic, not relative.
Yes. And so what it really is that they don't like the Anglo-Saxon tradition, Western European. They certainly don't like Christianity, right? These are the things that they despise. And they're willing to team with any other culture which they see as being openly hostile to that one. And it's become evident. And to Tina's point, and to your point too about this idea, some of the most loyal Americans you will find are actually the people that come from those countries on that travel ban list. But it's the people that were like horribly persecuted by the powers that be within that environment. And so you do have some people that will flee communist China, that will flee Iran, that will flee Somalia.
And they're the ones ringing the alarm bells right now.
And they will come over here and they will be the most loyal citizens possible. Now, when I look at that, I say, well, if they're the most loyal citizens possible, why would you want to restrict the ability to immigrate? Because they're unique. Because they're unique. And even if they're grateful to the United States, the real question is not, are you grateful? The real question is, do you understand how our system operates? Do you understand the moral framework which created it? Do you understand the various things that are necessary in order to ensure it continues to function? If you don't, or if as you become aware, you're like, oh, well, I really don't like that. Great. I'm glad that we could save you from whatever torment that you were experiencing, but now you need to go find a place that you can live that is being conducive to the sort of things that you want, or you need to go back and you need to fight for your country in order to make it what you want. But I will tell you this much. It is not our obligation, whether through the military or through the taxpayers, to put you up while you fix whatever's ever broken back there. And this is the part where when Trump says, you know, this is garbage, there are a lot of them. Again, the left is like, oh, I can't. The pearl clutching on our side's over.
Oh, we're done. We're going to identify when we think there's a crap culture. We're going to say so now, because there are some cultures who oppress and abuse children and women, and we're going to stop pretending we don't see it.
They practice a radically different way of life from ours. They're strangers. They're others.
And it's not superior.
Well, even
so
if
this idea that they should be able to come here and anyway.
Let me put it this way. Nate and Susie are some of our best friends on the planet. Right? Welcome to our house anytime. I'm sure we're welcome to their house.
Nate's our producer.
Nate's our producer. But we still have separate houses. Why? We decorate differently. Mm-hmm. We organize our daily thing differently. Does that mean we're enemies? Does that mean we can't No, we can. Right? But there's still separation with respect to what is our property and what is your property. And you get to arrange things the way you want within your property. And we get to arrange things we want with our property. And the reason why we're able to be such good and close friends is because it turns out we agree on 95% of things. And so we do all kinds of things together. And we dinner together and we hang out together and all that. But then we've also got our places that are
boundaries.
Ours. There's also boundaries on that, right? And those boundaries can extend to people groups. And the reason why you know this is because Iran has borders, right? Iran has borders that they rigorously enforce. Now we're gonna go into some of the arguments that the left commonly use. So the left commonly tries to use other arguments. No, all this immigration is great for our economy. You know, the Cato Institute makes this argument both from an economic standpoint and also from a liberty standpoint. But before we do that, I want to do a big shout out to the Tuttle Twins and Angel Studios. Now, I'm not going to say that Tuttle Twins is possibly some of the best children's entertainment ever made, but in another way, I am kind of saying that. By the way, on season 3, when they had George Washington, who did they get to do the voice for that guy? Because I hear it was amazingly authentic, like almost exactly the way George Washington sounds as far as you know. Here's the good news, right? holiday season, it's a great time to come around to have meals together and to have entertainment together, to sit down to watch a good, wholesome movie together. And Angel Studios provides just that. Now, if you go to angel.com/Nick Freitas, you can join the Angel Guild for less than $8 during the holidays. You're going to get access to the Tuttle Twins plus hundreds of other shows, movies, everything that you could possibly want to watch with yourself, with your kids, as a family. But here's another thing I want to point out here, which I think is so important about Angel Guild and Angel Studios. How many of you you've been busy, you've been working, you've been cooking, you've been wrapping Christmas presents or whatever else, and so the kids are sitting down and you let them watch a movie and you think it's going to be safe, and then a commercial comes on advertising something you don't want your kids to see. Or season 1 was great, but season 2 is crazy. Or episodes 1 through 3 were outstanding, but then season 4, all of a sudden the woke garbage comes on. And you get to a point where you're like, is there anything I can trust? Well, Angel Guild, you can. Angel Guild, you can. It's not just good because you can watch it together as a family. It's good because you can actually trust to let your kids watch something. Well, you got to go walk away and you can be sure that they're not going to have something come on that is just totally inappropriate for your children. So angel.com/Nick Freitas. Go on there, check it out, sign up for the guild, get that entertainment. All right, Christian. So we already know the left is going to claim that we're bigots, right? But they do that for everything. But they also make other arguments. And we see this headline right here. Somali Minnesotans drive economic growth because they pay $67 million in taxes annually. Now, I want to point something out. Isn't it fascinating that whenever the left is trying to make an argument for driving economic growth, it's always related to how much people pay in taxes, as if that's the primary function within government growth. We know it is not. But it's one of the arguments, the metrics they're using here right now. And he goes, Abdahakan Dawood added, me and my dad, we work hard every single day. These aren't people, or Trump said, these aren't people to work. They contribute nothing. I don't want them in our country. However, Concordia University economist Dr. Bruce Corey said his latest estimates showing the following. Somali Minnesotans generate at least $500 million in income annually. Somalis pay about $67 million in state and local taxes. Somalis have an estimated $8 billion impact on the state's economy. Somali GDP is around $12 billion. The estimated impact of these workers, Somali workers in Minnesota, could be about $8 billion, Corey said, and it's about what they produce and how that production in terms generates and ripples through the economy. What do you think, Christian?
So there's like about 100,000 Somalis in Minnesota. So you're telling me that they generate 500 million in income, but there's 100,000 of them, so they're generating $5,000. Mm-hmm. That's a terrible trade-off. Yeah. Like, I mean, this guy here, I mean, again, I don't even want to try to butcher his name where he says, me and my dad, we work hard every single day. I'm not saying that you can't find I don't know anything about this random person, right? But I'm not saying that you can't find an individual that might be an outlier from the group on either the high or low end of the bell curve. I'm saying that there is a bell curve, and the economic productivity of this group is actually net negative on the state of Minnesota. And how do I know this? Well, okay, here's what the headline, just to remind people, this is what the headline that the media wants to go with. 67 million in taxes is what they pay. Oh, okay. But remember that original tweet? Turns out that the fraud scheme is 250 million.
Oh, well, it looks like there's a bit of a deficit there.
So again, this is a fraud scheme. This isn't.
Yeah, this is just fraud.
This isn't legitimate welfare. Yeah, this isn't legitimate welfare. This is fraud. So the Somalis in Minnesota have defrauded the taxpayer $250 million in a welfare scheme. And apparently there's allegations, they're investigating this. There's allegations that this money is actually being shipped off to terrorist groups in Somalia. They're defrauding the state $250 million, and they're paying $67 million in taxes. That's fraud. That's not even counting welfare. Again, that's not counting like what we would... I mean, I think it would still be illegitimate philosophically, but you get what I mean? That's not counting legitimate welfare in the sense that like public housing, food stamps, unemployment insurance, like disability payments, right? The things that aren't being sent to a terrorist group in a foreign third world country. That's not even counting that. We're just talking about the fraud. They're already at a net negative. So, I mean, the crazy thing is, of course, you know that like the media throws this out here.
Yeah. Oh,
a day after Trump's comments because
that's so much. It's like, okay. So that's the benefit, presumably, that you're getting. That is the benefit. You're getting 67 million. Okay. So the cost associated in one massive fraud scheme is 250 million. So it drastically drastically dwarfs what you've just argued is the benefit. But let's look at some of these other ones. So I went into Grok, I asked for sources. They gave me a variety of sources. Cost of welfare for the Somali community. No official state or federal report provides a direct ethnicity-specific cost for Somali welfare usage. Broader immigrant welfare in Minnesota costs billions annually, but Somali-specific estimates are limited to fraud cases rather than total legitimate spending. Legitimate assistance cost. Here we go. Based on national averages, immigrant-headed households cost $1,000 to $2,000 more per year in welfare than U.S.-born ones due to higher program use. For 32,000 to 63,000 Somali recipients, that's the category. 63,000 is the higher estimate. This suggests an annual state-federal cost of $50 to $150 million. That's a rough extrapolation. Includes SNAP, Medicaid, and Medicaid for low income. This is a small fraction of Minnesota's $30 billion annual human services budget. Fund-related costs. Recent investigations highlight abuses, $300 million stolen in Feeding Our Future scandal, and probes into whether welfare funds reached Al-Shabaab, which is a Al-Qaeda associated terror group in Somalia. And then, again, Grok jumps all over. These are isolated fraud. Okay, so I want to say that, like let's assume 50 million to 150 million. So what it's basically saying is on the legitimate assistance costs, the estimated legitimate assistance costs, it's in many cases, it's probably double what they actually pay in taxes. That's for the legitimate stuff. Then you add the fraudulent stuff on top of it. All right, where are we at right now? So this is the sort of thing. And by the way, you look at it when it says legitimate costs, what do they include? They include things like welfare. They include things like SNAP benefits. They include things like Medicaid benefits. Where's public school in here? You don't think that's a significant benefit when you have, close to 100,000 people in your country with generally higher birth rates than the native population in the United States? This is what we're talking about. It's like, spare me your crap statistics, right? Yeah, this whole idea, and this is a problem I have with Cato too. Cato will look at immigration, and what they will do is they will systematically discount fraud, or they will systematically discount things that don't fall into a nice, neat welfare category. And they'll say, oh, look, see, the overall economic benefits are significantly higher than the costs associated with it. I'm sorry, but at some point I just don't buy it anymore. But that's just on the economics. So again, they can call us bigots. We don't care anymore because we know that they don't use any sort of objective standard for this. And we know they just use it as a way to discount our very legitimate arguments. Then they try to use the economics. The economics don't add up. Well, okay, let me put it this way. Here we go. Ready? For all the Democrats out there that want to run these elaborate welfare programs, for all the Democrats out there that want to engage in this kind of idea of diversity as our strength, what would happen to your state if all of the conservatives living in it decided tomorrow that we were going to go ahead and conduct ourselves exactly the same way that the majority of Somali immigrants do? Would you have the tax base necessary to fund it? I don't think you would. And that's really what this test comes down to is, okay, great. If the rest of the population of your state was conducting themselves the way that the percentages of the Somali population in Minnesota were conducting themselves, would you be able to fund your state? I can tell you the answer right now is no, you wouldn't. We can tell based off of the numbers and the fraud. So once again, if you want to make an argument, and at this point I want to know what your argument is, because right now your argument is, if you don't agree with me, you're mean. And I'm gonna point out that, 67 million, okay. But I will tell you this much. If I charged you 4 times what you actually produced for me, or what I actually produced, you'd be furious. You'd go bankrupt. So what's the next argument?
It's more racism.
Yeah, no, you already made that argument. We've addressed the racism thing. We've addressed the economics thing. What is your next argument? I think I know what it is. These groups will vote for Democrats. This is power. This is power.
You said something earlier in this show that I was about to add to when you were saying that there were 2 things about early immigration to the United States in the 19th century that made it a more positive thing than a negative thing. And it's, by the way, it's also worth noting that there is a trade-off. Mm-hmm. Not a lot of people talk about that. America did change. You could argue for the better in some ways, but America did change even in the 19th century when you brought over large numbers of Germans and Italians and Irish. And I say this as somebody with a German last name. It was not the same thing as when it was effectively 100% English colony. Now, I would like to believe that it was a positive thing that we brought these people over, but it did change the country. You have to admit that. And by the way, I say this with somebody who also has I'm a quarter English as well. Yeah. So most Americans are a hodgepodge of these things. But there's a third thing. You brought up two examples. You said we didn't have a welfare system at the time. And I think that that's a huge driver of the problem. Huge driver of the problem. It's not just that you changed Hart-Celler, it's that you had a welfare magnet as well. It was both of those things. Yeah. That was the first one. Then the second one is that there was a genuine desire to assimilate into that existing culture, and that it was easier to do it because the groups of people that were moving were geographically closer, had a longer lineage and history. They shared the same religion, even if it might have been different denominations. Yeah. The difference between a German and an Englishman, there's a reason they're called Anglo-Saxons, is significantly less than the difference between somebody from Laos and somebody from England. And again, that doesn't mean that the person from Laos is a bad person. That's just the
English.
The
English royalty is actually genetically German.
That is not a moral claim. That is a statement of fact, right? But there's a third component, and you just hinted at it. It's coming back again. There was a third component of the immigration thing that was actually a negative. Those first two were positives, but there was a third that drove this, and it was a negative. And it actually explains, if you allow me a second to bring back the graph, it actually explains why this thing does dips, and especially this dip here and this dip here. And there was a patronage system. So remember Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed. Yeah. When you had vast numbers of Irish immigrants coming over in the 19th century, they would come into Ellis Island, go into New York City, and there was no state welfare system, but there was political patronage systems. The Democratic Party would put you up in a house, get you a job, put your kids in school, but you better vote for them in every single election. And eventually, vast numbers of them came in, and it created it fueled massive amounts of political corruption is what this did, this patronage system. And there was a backlash, and that led to immigration restrictions that took place at various points in the 19th century, the most famous being the 1924 Immigration Act. And it wasn't just the Irish. I mean, there was, the Chinese immigrants as well. It was called by some people the Chinese Exclusion Act. Yeah. Because it banned almost all immigration from China. And that was an issue on the West Coast. But one of the huge things that drove immigration backlash, we have this idea, the progressive mindset is all immigration restrictions in the 19th century was just driven by pure racism. Yeah. I'm sure you could find examples of prejudice, but a huge chunk of the immigration backlash in the 19th century that led to restrictions that you see in the graph here was because it was fueling political corruption. And it's the same story, different groups of people, same party, ironically, different parts of the country, but it's the same thing today. Yeah.
Well, let me ask a question. Because Thomas Sowell has pointed this out before. He goes, the next time a liberal tells you how important diversity is, ask them how many conservatives they have in their sociology department. All right, so let's put it differently. All right, let's take country of origin out of it. Is it fair to say that people that grow up in a Protestant religious tradition with representative government, property rights, free market economics, representative government, and general equality before the law have more in common with people that grow up in similar systems, or would they have more in common with people that grow up in heavily patriarchal, and I mean that in the actual sense, not the fake one that the left likes to use, but the sort of domineering patriarchal society without representative government, without free market economics, without the sort of property rights that we enjoy, and with a very, very different structure with respect to how the law is implemented based off of class. See, all of a sudden, when I word it that way, everyone's like, well, yeah, of course. Okay, but here's the thing. Certain countries are organized that way, and if people are coming from those countries, it's not unreasonable to assume that is what they're used to. If you bring them over one at a time, they may very, very easily assimilate. If you bring them over in bulk, it's far more likely to stick with what you know. Carl Benjamin talked about this, and Carl Benjamin is all about protecting English culture. But he's like, it's not unreasonable to assume that if 20,000 people come over from Pakistan, they're probably going to be more likely to stick with what they know than try to assimilate, even if we would argue that the assimilation is better for them in the long run.
Especially if it's easy to do that.
Yes.
Especially if it's set up in such a way where it's really easy just to latch on to your little group
Yeah.
and
If I
not
was-
go outside the group. Like if I can go and I can actually function in society and never have to learn another language, that's simple, easy.
When I went over to Bangladesh, for a training mission, and we ended up having a day off. Now, we saw a lot of things out there. We went into the countryside. We were doing our missions and stuff like that, working with all that. But then we had this one moment. It was like, oh, do you guys want to go to the English embassy? Yes. Why? Because I can go to the English embassy. I know they'll have the beer I want to drink. I know they'll have, right? Why? Well, how did I know that? Had I visited the English embassy before? Had I scoped it out? Did I have empirical evidence that based off of, the actual menu? No, I just knew it was an English embassy.
It was a heuristic.
It was an English embassy. It was a heuristic. And guess what? I was right. Right? I was right. So why did I want that?
Nick, you were being very stereotypical.
I was being very stereotypical. But my point is that if I had to go over into Bangladesh right now and live, and I found a large expat population of English, Irish, Scottish, and Americans, I'd probably hang out with them. I would certainly go there first to figure out, hey, what's the lay of the land? How do I get this stuff? Why shared language, shared values, for the most part, shared understanding of things. They would know what to tell me to avoid. They'd be like, don't go here, or don't say that. Why would they tell me don't say that? Well, because they would probably know based off of me being an American what I might be prone to do that would get me into trouble in this culture. So it makes sense that I would seek out people with common understanding. But the thing is that if there's so many of them, well, then I don't need to assimilate.
The assimilation pressure breaks down.
I don't need to assimilate.
It goes back to what I was saying earlier when we were talking about the waves of immigration, and I was talking about before the revolution, and I gave that story of what happened to the Western Roman Empire. The Romans were excellent assimilators in many respects, similar to us.
Yeah.
Now, they were a lot more violent about their assimilation in some cases, right? But like Roman culture did spread across the Mediterranean. And yet that mechanism broke down once it was no longer small numbers, because the Romans took Germans all throughout history in small numbers.
Yeah.
Once you had entire tribes moving by the hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions, the assimilation structure ended at that point.
All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to go into our round table. So this is where every person gets about 3 minutes to say, okay, here's the problem. Here's where it's at. Trump has told us what he's going to do. What would you do? So you get 3 minutes to explain what would you do. But before we get to that, I want to make sure everyone is aware. If you've ever been wondering, what should I get friends and family and people I care about for Christmas? It certainly isn't the crap that you're finding at random stores. No. It's the stuff you're getting from your very favorite social media personality, Tina. But also Christian and I. And you guys have all seemed to appreciate the snarky little mugs we've had. Well, guess what? That sort of lovable snark and sarcasm is not just on our coffee mugs. We've got it on t-shirts. We've got it on hoodies. We've got it on a variety of things. We've got cool patches. We've got hats. We've got everything. Plus now we have coffee. That's right. Nick's Ugly Mug Coffee is now available. So now not only do you get the mug, you get something to put in it, which means you can sign up for subscriptions. That's right. You never have to be tired again. With enough brew around and find out, you can be patriotic faster than ever before. So go and check out the link in the description. Go check out some merch. We got a bunch of Christmas bundles on sale. And if you buy before December 9th, they can get there in time for you to wrap it. And you should wrap it. Don't be classless. All right. Wrap that up and give it to them. All right. Once again, thank you very much. And let's move on to our final roundtable. So Christian, we've identified some of the problems. What are some solutions? What would His Imperial Majesty, the Generalissimo of America, Christian Hines, what would he do to fix our immigration problems and
I just want to
preserve
clarify,
America?
if I actually got my way, I would not be king. I would be a terrible king. I'm calling for one. I have no problems calling myself a monarchist, but I would not be the monarch. But if I had my way policy wise, couple things. I would declare a total immigration moratorium for 10, 20 years.
Okay.
With very, very, and I mean like very limited exceptions. I would end all immigration for a generation. I would repeal Hart-Celler after that fact. I would reinstate something similar to the national origins formula. You could make some tweaks and changes to the original formula from the 1920s, but something similar to it. I would change citizenship laws and some of our electoral laws to bar dual citizenship for anybody. You either become an American or you're a guest. I would make it so that way only native-born Americans are eligible to run for office or vote, not immigrants. I would adopt a set of policies kind of similar to Aaron McIntyre, that you cannot vote or get citizenship if you come here permanently and you immigrate after that cool-off period and after we repeal Hart-Celler. Your children can stay here and get citizenship, but not vote, or at the very least not hold office. And their children will have all the rights of any natural-born American citizen. And that sounds extreme, but I don't think that it's, to some people, they say that sounds extreme, but I actually don't think that it's pretty extreme to say that, no, we want a limited franchise of Americans rather than an unlimited franchise of some sort of open society of anybody from the entire world coming here and radically changing the political or cultural structure of this country. If you have that, and that's what we have right now, just a complete open system, this country's going to cease to exist in its current form 50 or 100 years from now.
Okay. Tina.
I like some of what Christian is saying. And I can't believe he was saying it with Connor right here in the room, saying no more immigration while Connor's trying to immigrate. Anyway, okay. So just a couple of things I think right off the bat we need to do is I agree with not letting naturalized citizens hold office. You need to at least be second generation here, born in the U.S. and be here. I also think that we need to not have any benefits available to first generation immigrants. They need to come on their own 2 feet. And if they can't, then they don't immigrate. And that's that. We're not here for everybody to come and suck off of us. If you can come here and make your own way and provide a benefit to our country, great, you're welcome. So no benefits. And in fact, I'm really kind of becoming anti-benefit anyway. But anyway, the other thing is that I don't believe you should have dual citizenship. I think you basically need to renounce your former country and your loyalties need to lie here. And in order to become a citizen of this country, I think learning about our origin isn't the only thing they need to learn. I think they need to understand what's culturally acceptable here and what is not. And they need to be proficient in the knowledge of that. So how we deal with certain things in our country, they need to know. Because I don't want somebody moving here and being caught off guard and not realizing that they can't do certain things here or that it's not okay to do certain things here. No, they should know that coming in. So I do like the idea of bringing your best and your brightest here. No benefits. So and I agree with Christian, I think, on the voting situation, but I'm not 100% on that. I do think there are some people that when they move here and start paying the taxes here, you've got skin in the game. But that also coincides with no benefits. So you're paying the taxes, so you get to vote, but no benefits.
So I'll talk about what I agree with and some things that I would do a little bit differently. So I would not do an entire moratorium. I would cancel the benefits. I don't think benefits can be an enticement for immigration to the United States. Well, you should be coming to the United States first for two reasons. You want to become an American and you appreciate the opportunities and the systems that we provide. You're not coming over here to be subversive. I believe that anybody that's coming over here on any sort of visa that engages in any sort of activity which could be considered hostile to the United States. This is talking about overthrowing our government. This is talking about, engaging in the sort of like these like violent Palestinian rallies, the violent BLM rallies, automatic removal of your student visa, and you are now taken off the list of being able to immigrate to the United States. You can't work here, you can't study here, and you're not going to become a citizen here. Because if when you came as a guest, you treated our house this way, I'm never going to invite you back, and I'm certainly not going to give you residency in the house, right? So that's done. The other thing too is I think we need to, again, reinstate with tweaks this idea of country of origin, but I wouldn't put it so much on country. I would put it a little bit more on these ideas of what are the objective criteria from the country from which you came. So is the cultural institutions for which you have been raised in and believe in, are they conducive to the cultural institutions that you're now adopting, right? If not, we're going to have a much higher level of scrutiny for that. Okay, but that does not mean we don't remove scrutiny from other countries, because quite frankly, one thing I agree with leftists on is, I totally agree that white people are the problem. We just disagree on which white people, because quite frankly, I think leftist white people have been one of the biggest banes of our existence within the United States. The other thing, so the benefits, totally agree with, bringing back some of the restrictions. I would also end birthright citizenship. When you look at the United States and why the 13th and 14th Amendments were set up, and I mentioned them in conjunction, even though one deals mainly with slavery and one deals mainly with naturalization. When it says the jurisdiction thereof, what it meant was to ensure that people that had been enslaved in the United States were becoming citizens of the United States. Right? It was not so that if you cross the border and immediately walk over to an ER and have a baby, now all of a sudden your child is a United States citizen. That is no longer a thing. You have to have a parent that is a legal United States citizen before you can actually have that. You can't just automatically be here and have a kid. I also think that there should be getting rid of dual citizenship. If you're going to become American citizen, now can you come to the United States on a visa? But sure. But if you're going to become an American citizen, it's because you want to be an American citizen, not a citizen of 2 or 3 other countries. Sorry, way it is, way I feel. Same thing with respect to running for office. I'm becoming far more skeptical. I want to go so far as to say that you absolutely cannot run for office unless you were born in the United States. I think there could be exceptions to that rule, but I think we need to view it with a heavy degree of scrutiny. The other thing, there was one other thing I wanted to say on this that I would implement. Oh, the other thing that nobody has really mentioned, denaturalization. I
like this. Hold on.
I actually think we need to have a clearer process for what constitutes denaturalization.
Yes.
I think one of the things that we need to take into account is that if it is later determined that you engage in fraud to become a United States citizen,
we denaturalize you.
We denaturalize you. All right. If you are openly advocating for the overthrow of the illegitimate overthrow, I'm not talking about I want a different president. I'm talking about the violent overthrow of the United States. You're denaturalized and we kick you out. I think we should be strongly considering other criteria as well that would qualify for denaturalization. And so these are some of the things that I would add in the buzz to fix the problem that we currently have. I wouldn't put an absolute moratorium on integration for the next 20 years, but I would reduce it significantly. I would vastly reduce it to almost nothing at this point, and we would have very, very strict criteria with respect to, again, why you're immigrating. And again, I think one of the best things that we could do is in federal welfare benefits for first generation immigrants. You get to come on your own steam. You get to prove that you want to contribute to the United States. There's other things that I would do for people that immigrate with respect to if you get over here and you fail to contribute. Well,
denaturalization.
Well,
in order to naturalize, you have to be contributing anyway under that program.
Yeah. But
there is another
the whole getting your citizenship should not automatically mean, okay, now I don't have to contribute and I can just, I don't think there should be any federal welfare programs, period. But I definitely think it shouldn't apply for people that immigrant. And I would even extend elements of that to first generation immigrants, because it needs to be so ingrained in the process that you are coming here to contribute, not just take. And unfortunately, we've created a perverse incentive structure where coming and taking has become a primary motivator for coming to the United States. That's exploitation.
Even student visas, right? Aren't a lot of the student visas not on their own steam either?
I can't speak to that right now in this. So anyways, to give everyone kind of a final wrap up of what has gone on. Look, I think we've made the case. It's not that immigrants have not contributed to the United States. They certainly have. But English settlers, British settlers, are what originally comprised the original 13 colonies, the vast majority of the original 13 colonies. They are the people that established the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, not to mention the state governments and pretty much all of the 13 colonies. They were primarily British and primarily Protestant. Now, does that mean that this country has not benefited from other immigrants? Yes. Does this mean that this country or does this mean this country has not benefited from immigrants? No, of course we have. Were there, do we have to recognize the contributions, the people that were brought over to this country in bondage? No, we do have to acknowledge that. But that's not what built this country. That's not what built this country. There was a certain set of values that built this country, and you can read about them all in the Declaration of Independence, not to mention the various debates that took place over the Constitution, that took place over the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers that have taken place since then. And so while we can appreciate the benefits of immigration, we also get to acknowledge the dangers of immigration done poorly. And Minnesota has provided us the latest in examples, not just with respect to this fraud, but with respect to a very large population which has decided to use the United States for what we can provide, while at the same time, not only constantly complaining about it, but at various times potentially acting to subvert it. And we don't have to put up with that. And they know we don't have to put up with it. Why? Because they wanted to put it up with it in their countries. So I'm going to leave you with this. If you not only had to flee your country, but you had to travel through several other countries that were far more similar to yours than ours, then when you get here, here's a piece of advice. Do not try to turn what we've created, the sort of place that you can flee to, into the sort of place that you fled from. And at this point, we're not asking anymore. We're letting you know that's the new dynamic, and it is perfectly reasonable. It does not lack in compassion, and it does not lack in reason. Just as we tell our neighbors to respect our homes when they come over and visit, you will do the same. Or you can go back. And that's not being mean. That's being reasonable. But at this point, it's also a question of survival. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Let us know what you think in the comments. And oh, by the way, the show doesn't actually end here. We're about to go into postgame. So if you would like to join our community, check it out on Circle. Again, link is in the description. We've got, I think, well over 5,000 people in our Circle community now. We do all sorts of things over there, whether it be discussing issues. Heck, we've had several people, I think, get married or engaged now, having met through that community. Still working on Christian. We'll get them there. We'll get them there. Actually, if you're an eligible bachelorette, this guy's still available over here. Once again, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.